The autumn wind cut sharp across the Montana plains in 1887, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and the promise of a brutal winter. In a land where survival meant everything and kindness was often seen as weakness, one man's giant heart was about to change the lives of 12 forgotten children forever. This is the story of how a single act of compassion echoed through generations, proving that sometimes the biggest people carry the biggest hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun barely crept over Copper Ridge when Samuel Big Sam Mackenzie stepped out of his cabin, stretching his massive frame against the doorway. At 6 feet 8 inches tall and built like the oak trees that dotted his property, Sam cast a shadow that could cover a small wagon. But despite his intimidating size, there wasn't a mean bone in his body. His calloused hands, each the size of dinner plates, moved with surprising gentleness as he scattered feed for his chickens. The birds, unafraid of his towering presence, clucked contentedly around his enormous boots. This had been his routine for the past 3 years, ever since he'd lost his beloved wife, Martha, to the fever that swept through the territory. Martha had been barely 5 feet tall, a sparrow to his eagle, but she'd filled their home with laughter and warmth that made even the harshest Montana winters feel like spring. She used to tease him, saying God made him so big because he knew he'd need a heart to match. Now, in the suffocating silence of his empty cabin, Sam wondered if having such a large heart was more curse than blessing. The Mackenzie spread stretched across 1,500 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the territory. Sam had built it from nothing, starting with just a handful of cattle and a determination that matched his physical strength. His hands had laid every fence post, built every barn beam, and dug every well. The ranch should have been his pride and joy, but without Martha's voice calling him in for supper or her gentle humming drifting from the kitchen, it felt more like a monument to loneliness. Sam's nearest neighbor, old Pete Harrison, lived 12 miles south. The closest town, Millfield, was a hard day's ride through rough country. Most folks avoided the journey unless absolutely necessary, which suited Sam just fine these days. He'd grown tired of the pitying looks and well-meaning but empty condolences. "She's in a better place now," they'd say, as if that somehow made the ache in his chest any easier to bear. The isolation hadn't bothered him when Martha was alive. They'd been content with just each other's company, planning for the children they hoped to have someday. Martha had already picked out names: Daniel for a boy, Rebecca for a girl. She'd sewn tiny quilts and carved wooden toys, filling a hope chest with dreams that would never come to pass. After she died, Sam had locked that chest away in the barn, unable to bear the sight of those small, hopeful things. His days now followed a predictable pattern. Rise before dawn, tend to the animals, check the fences, repair what needed fixing. The physical labor helped keep his mind occupied, though it couldn't fill the hollow spaces Martha had left behind. Evenings were the hardest. He'd sit on the porch she'd loved so much, watching the sun set over the mountains, and listen to the wind whisper through the grass like her voice calling his name. Sam had always been what folks called a gentle giant. Even as a boy growing up in Ohio, he'd been the one other children came to when they were hurt or scared. His mother used to say he'd been born with an extra helping of compassion to balance out his extra helping of size. It was that gentle nature that had first drawn Martha to him at a church social back in Ohio, when most women were too intimidated to even speak to him. "You're not nearly as scary as you look," she'd told him that first evening, her eyes twinkling with mischief as she had to crane her neck to meet his gaze. "In fact, I bet you're just a big softy underneath all that muscle." She'd been right, of course. Martha had always been right about these things. Sam would rescue injured animals, help struggling neighbors without being asked, and never raised his voice in anger. His size made him formidable, but his heart made him gentle. It was a combination that had served him well in building his ranch and his reputation as a fair, honest man. But now, as autumn deepened into what promised to be a harsh winter, Sam found himself questioning everything. What was the point of having all this land, all these resources, if there was no one to share them with? The cattle brought in good money, sure enough, but what use was wealth when you ate every meal alone? He'd received several letters from his sister back in Ohio, begging him to come home. "There's nothing left for you out there, Samuel," she'd written in her neat, careful script. "Come back where people know you, where you have family. This wilderness is no place for a man alone." Part of him was tempted. It would be easy to sell the ranch, pack up Martha's things, and head back to the familiar green hills of Ohio. He could find work, maybe even find another wife eventually, though the thought of replacing Martha made his chest tighten with something. Between guilt and grief, but every time he seriously considered leaving, something held him back. Maybe it was stubborn pride, or maybe it was the memory of Martha's voice the day they'd first seen this land. "This is it, Sam," she'd whispered, her small hand squeezing his massive one. "This is where we'll build our life together." They'd stood on the very spot where their cabin now sat, looking out over the rolling grassland that stretched to the distant mountains. Martha had been pregnant then, though they'd lose that baby just 2 months later, the first of many heartbreaks. That would test their faith. But in that moment, with the Montana sun warming their faces and endless possibility stretching before them, they both felt it, the bone-deep certainty that this was home. So Sam stayed, more out of loyalty to Martha's memory than any real hope for the future. He worked his land, tended his cattle, and tried not to think too hard about the empty years stretching ahead. The loneliness was a constant companion now, as familiar as his own shadow. What he didn't know as he went about his solitary morning routine that October day was that 12 pairs of desperate eyes were already watching him from the ridge above his property. 12 children who had been walking for days, cold and hungry and running out of hope, were about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. The Cherokee children had been traveling the old hunting trails that crisscrossed the territory, following paths their ancestors had walked for generations. But these weren't pleasure walks or spiritual journeys. These were the desperate steps of the displaced, the forgotten, the ones who'd fallen through the cracks of a changing world. They'd heard stories about the giant, who lived alone on Copper Ridge. Some said he was mean as a grizzly, others claimed he was touched in the head. But hunger had a way of making even the scariest stories seem less important than the possibility of food. And from their vantage point on the ridge, looking down at Sam's well-maintained ranch with its fat cattle and sturdy buildings, it looked like paradise to children who hadn't had a proper meal in days. As Sam went about his morning chores, unaware of his audience, the oldest of the children, a 13-year-old boy named Thomas Whitehorse, was trying to work up the courage to approach. The younger ones looked to him for leadership, their hollow cheeks and 2 large eyes, speaking of desperation that went beyond simple hunger. The decision of whether to reveal themselves to the giant below would determine not just their immediate survival, but the course of all their lives. And somewhere in the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, carrying with them the promise of the early winter that would make this choice a matter of life and death. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas Whitehorse pressed his back against the cold granite of the ridge, his breath coming in small white puffs in the crisp morning air. At 13, he carried the weight of 12 lives on his narrow shoulders, a burden no child should bear, but one that had been thrust upon him when the world turned upside down. Behind him, huddled in the meager shelter of scrub pine and weathered rocks, 11 other children waited in silence. The youngest, little Mary Crow Feather, was barely 4 years old, her round face gaunt from hunger, her once bright eyes now dull with the kind of exhaustion that comes from walking too far on too little food. She clutched a corn husk doll that had seen better days, its yarn hair matted and its painted face worn smooth by countless desperate embraces. Thomas had been caring for these children for 3 weeks now, ever since the soldiers came to their settlement near the Judith River. It hadn't been a reservation, not officially, just a small community where displaced Cherokee families had gathered, trying to rebuild some semblance of the life they'd lost when they were forced from their ancestral lands. Decades ago, the children's parents had been taken to work the railroad camps, they were told. Temporary work assignments, the captain had said, his words as cold as the October wind. The children will be cared for at the mission school in Helena. But Thomas had overheard the soldiers talking when they thought no one was listening. There was no mission school waiting for them. There were government boarding schools, places where Cherokee children went in and American children came out. If they came out at all. So, in the chaos of that terrible morning, as families were torn apart and wagons loaded with the few possessions the soldiers deemed necessary, Thomas had made a decision that would haunt and define him. He'd gathered the youngest ones, the ones who would suffer most in those schools, and they'd slipped away into the wilderness like smoke on the wind. Now, 3 weeks and countless miles later, they were running out of options. The children's faces told the story of their journey, hollow cheeks, clothes hanging loose on frames that grew thinner each day, feet wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find when their shoes gave out. They'd survived on berries, roots, and the occasional fish Thomas could catch in the streams they crossed. But winter was coming fast, and children couldn't live on hope and wild onions. "Thomas," whispered Sarah Gentle Rain, a 10-year-old with braids so long they reached her waist, "my belly hurts again." Thomas reached into his nearly empty pouch and pulled out the last of their dried berries, perhaps a dozen wrinkled sour. Things that would do little to satisfy even one child's hunger. He divided them carefully, making sure the youngest got the largest shares. Mary Crow Feather accepted her portion with the solemnity of an old woman, understanding even at 4 that food was precious beyond words. "Tell us again about the place." "We're going," said James Running Bear, age 8, his voice barely above a whisper. It had become their evening ritual, this storytelling, a way to keep hope alive when their bodies were failing them. Thomas closed his eyes, summoning the words. His grandmother had told him before the soldiers took her away to the reservation in Oklahoma. "Far to the west," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of the old stories, "there's a valley where our people lived in the time before time. The mountains protect it from the cold winds, and the streams run clear and full of fish. The earth there remembers Cherokee feet, and the trees still sing our songs." It was a beautiful lie, or perhaps a beautiful truth from a time so long ago, it had become myth. Thomas didn't know if such a place existed, but it gave the children something to walk toward besides endless uncertainty. The younger ones had begun to believe in it with the fierce faith that only children possess, painting pictures in their minds of warm lodges and full bellies and grandmothers who would wrap them in soft blankets and sing them to sleep. But looking down at the giant's ranch below, Thomas felt the weight of reality pressing down on him like a stone. They weren't going to make it to any mystical valley. Half the children were already showing signs of what his grandmother had called the hungry sickness, that hollow-eyed weakness that came when the body began to consume itself. Little Joseph Quietstream, only 5 years old, had developed a cough that rattled in his chest like autumn leaves in the wind. From their hiding place, they'd been watching the giant for 2 days now, studying his movements, trying to determine if he was the kind of man who might help them or the kind who would turn them over to the authorities. The stories they'd heard about him were contradictory. Some said he was a brute who'd kill a man for looking at him wrong. Others claimed he was simple-minded and harmless. But Thomas had good eyes, trained by generations of hunters and trackers, and what he saw didn't match either story. He watched the way the giant's massive hands gentled when he tended his animals, how he took time to scratch behind the ears of an old barn cat, how he sat on his porch in the evenings, not with the swagger of a dangerous man, but with the slumped shoulders of someone carrying his own invisible burden. "He's lonely," Sarah had observed after their first day of watching. At 10, she had an intuitive understanding of human nature that sometimes startled Thomas with its accuracy. "Lonely people can be dangerous," Thomas had replied, but even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. His grandmother had always said that dangerous people made themselves big and loud, while truly strong people moved quietly through the world. The giant moved quietly, still. Approaching any white man was a risk that could cost them everything. Thomas had seen what happened to Cherokee children who trusted the wrong people. He'd seen friends disappear into boarding schools and emerge years later as strangers, forbidden to speak their own language, their names changed, their spirits broken like horses that had been gentled until they forgot they once ran free. But Mary Crowfeather was getting weaker. Yesterday she'd stumbled twice on ground that should have been easy for a child to navigate. Little Joseph's cough was getting worse, and Thomas had noticed blood on the rag the boy tried to hide when he thought no one was looking. They couldn't keep running on empty stomachs and desperate hope. "Thomas," came a small voice from behind him. It was Rebecca Moonbeam, a 7-year-old whose parents had taught her to read from a worn Bible before the soldiers came. She was one of the brightest children he'd ever known, able to remember entire stories after hearing them just once. "I had the dream again, the dream." Several of the children had been having the same dream for the past week, a vision of a tall man with gentle hands who fed them soup from a big iron pot. In the dream, there's warmth and safety and the sound of children laughing. Thomas didn't put much stock in dream visions, but his grandmother had always said that when many people dreamed the same dream, it was worth paying attention to. "What happened in the dream this time?" he asked, though he already knew. The dream never changed. The tall man saw us hiding, and instead of being angry, he smiled. He had sad eyes but a kind smile. And he said, Rebecca paused, her brow furrowing with concentration. He said, "Children shouldn't have to be hungry. Come and eat." Below them, the giant emerged from his barn carrying a bucket of what looked like milk. Even from their elevated position, his size was impressive. Thomas estimated he had to duck to get through doorways, and his shoulders were broad enough to block out the sun. But there was something about the way he moved, careful, deliberate, almost apologetic, as if he was constantly aware of taking up too much space in the world. "We have to decide," Thomas said quietly, more to himself than to the others. But Sarah heard him. "Decide what?" "Whether we keep running or whether we trust. What does your heart tell you?" Sarah asked. It was something Thomas's grandmother used to say when the mind couldn't make sense of a problem. Sometimes the heart could see clearly. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to listen past the fear, past the hunger, past the desperate calculations of survival. In the silence of his mind, he heard his grandmother's voice. "Sometimes, little hawk, the Great Spirit puts helpers in our path, but we have to be brave enough to recognize them." When he opened his eyes, the giant was looking directly up at their hiding place. For a moment, Thomas's heart stopped. Had they been discovered? But the man's expression wasn't angry or suspicious. It was curious, concerned, even. As if he'd sensed their presence, but wasn't threatened by it. The giant raised one massive hand in what might have been a greeting, then turned and walked back toward his cabin. But he left the bucket of milk sitting on a tree stump near the edge of his property, close enough to the ridge that someone could approach it without being seen from the main buildings. "He knows we're here," whispered James, his young voice tight with fear. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "And he's not afraid of us." The question was, should they be afraid of him? Thomas looked at the faces of the children counting on him, Mary Crow Feather with her hollow cheeks, Joseph with his rattling cough, Rebecca with her two bright eyes that spoke of fever beginning to take hold. They were out of time for careful planning and cautious observation. Sometimes trust was just another word for surrendering to the inevitable. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it was the first step toward salvation. The milk in the bucket was still warm when Thomas crept down from the ridge in the pre-dawn darkness. His moccasins, worn thin from weeks of walking, made no sound on the frost-covered grass as he approached the tree stump where the giant had left his offering. The white liquid gleamed like liquid moonlight in the pale starshine, and Thomas's stomach clenched with longing so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. He'd left the other children hidden in a shallow cave they'd discovered on the far side of the ridge, a natural shelter carved by wind and water that would protect them from the worst of the weather. Sarah was keeping watch over the youngest ones, and Thomas had promised to return before full sunrise. If he didn't come back, she was to take the children and continue west toward the mythical valley he'd been describing in his stories. But as Thomas knelt beside the bucket and saw his own gaunt reflection wavering in the milk surface, he knew there would be no continuing west. Mary Crow Feather had barely been able to walk yesterday, and Joseph's cough had gotten worse during the night. Two of the older boys, Daniel Swift Arrow and Peter Stone Wolf, had developed the telltale signs of frostbite on their fingers despite the relatively mild weather. Winter was still weeks away, but their bodies were already surrendering to cold and hunger. Thomas cupped his hands and drank deeply, the rich milk coating his throat like liquid warmth. He'd never tasted anything so wonderful. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to drink milk every morning, to never have to count berries or ration water, or wonder where the next meal would come from. "Tastes good, doesn't it?" The voice came from directly behind him, deep and gentle, but Thomas still nearly jumped out of his skin. He spun around to find the giant standing just 10 feet away, his massive frame outlined against the lightning sky. Up close, Samuel Mackenzie was even more imposing than he'd appeared from the ridge. His shoulders were broad as a barn door, his hands large enough to crush a man's skull without effort, but his eyes were kind. "Easy, son," Sam said, raising one enormous hand in a calming gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just wanted to see if you were real or if I'd been imagining things." Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like water, and besides, where could he go that those long strides couldn't follow? Instead, he straightened to his full height, which still left him looking up at the giant's belt buckle, and tried to summon whatever dignity he had left. "My name is Thomas Whitehorse," he said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "I thank you for the milk." Sam's eyebrows rose slightly. The boy spoke English well, with only the faintest trace of an accent. "Whitehorse," he mused. "That's Cherokee, isn't it?" Thomas nodded warily. In his experience, white men who recognized Cherokee names were either missionaries wanting to save his soul or government officials wanting to relocate his body. Neither option had worked out well for his people. "My wife knew some Cherokee," Sam continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather instead of having this strange pre-dawn encounter. "Met a family when we were traveling through Tennessee years back. Good people. Taught her how to weave baskets from river grass." The casual mention of Cherokee people as good people caught Thomas off guard. Most white men he'd encountered spoke of his people as problems to be solved or obstacles to be removed. The giant's matter-of-fact acceptance was unexpected. "Where are the others?" Sam asked. Thomas's stomach dropped. "Others?" Sam's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Son, I've been tracking game through these hills for 15 years. I know the difference between one person's tracks and a dozen. Plus, I found this yesterday." He pulled a small object from his pocket, Mary Crow Feather's cornhusk doll, its painted face smiling up at them both. Thomas's hand flew to his medicine pouch, but the doll wasn't there. Mary must have dropped it during their climb to the cave. His mind raced, calculating distances and escape routes, but Sam was already speaking again. "How many children are you looking after?" The question was asked so gently, with such genuine concern, that Thomas found himself answering before he could stop himself. 11. The youngest is 4. Sam's expression grew troubled. 4 years old, out here in this weather? We had no choice, Thomas said, defensive now. They were going to take us to the boarding schools. Separate us. Change us into something we're not. Ah, Sam nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. I've heard about those places. Heard they're not kind to Indian children. The way he said Indian children, not as a category or a problem, but as individuals deserving of kindness, made something tight in Thomas's chest begin to loosen. But he couldn't afford to trust too easily. Too much depended on his caution. Are you going to turn us in? Thomas asked bluntly. Sam was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where the sun was beginning to paint the peaks with gold. My wife, he said finally, used to say that the measure of a man wasn't in what he could take, but in what he chose to give. She'd have skinned me alive if I turned away hungry children. He looked down at Thomas, his expression serious. How? Long since you've all had a proper meal? Thomas tried to remember. Days blurred together when you were constantly walking, constantly hungry. A week, maybe more, we've been eating berries and roots. And the little ones? How are they holding up? The concern in the giant's voice was unmistakable, and Thomas felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Not well, he admitted. Quietly, Mary, the one with the doll, she can barely walk. And Joseph has a cough that won't go away. Sam's jaw tightened. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. Then louder, well, we can't have that. Come on. He started walking toward the cabin with long, purposeful strides. Thomas hesitated, torn between hope and terror. This could be a trap. The giant could be leading him toward waiting soldiers. Or government officials. But as Sam reached the porch and turned back, Thomas saw something in his face that decided him. The giant looked afraid, not of Thomas or the other children, but for them, afraid of what might happen if he didn't help. The others are up in the cave, Thomas called out, his voice carrying farther in the still morning air than he'd intended. Sam nodded. Can you bring them down? They're scared. They don't know you like I do. Like you do? Sam's eyebrows rose again. Son, you've known me for all of 5 minutes. Thomas considered this. Sometimes 5 minutes is enough. Sam studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Tell you what, I'll make breakfast. Lots of it. Biscuits, bacon, eggs, the works. When you smell it cooking, you bring them down. If they're still scared, they can eat on the porch. But nobody should be hungry. When there's food to spare. He paused at the cabin door, his massive frame filling the doorway. Thomas? Yes, sir. My name's Sam. Samuel Mackenzie. And for what it's worth, I think you're about the bravest 13-year-old I've ever met. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Unexpectedly. When was the last time an adult had called him brave instead of troublesome or dangerous? How did you know I was 13? Same age as my nephew back in Ohio, Sam said. He's got that same look, like he's carrying the world on his shoulders and pretending it doesn't weigh anything. With that, he disappeared into the cabin, leaving. Thomas standing alone in the growing daylight, Mary's doll clutched in his hand and hope blooming in his chest like wildflowers. After rain. Thomas climbed back up to the cave as quickly as his tired legs would carry him. The children were awake, huddled together for warmth, their faces pinched with cold and hunger. Sarah looked up as he approached, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of danger. Well? She whispered. Thomas held up Mary's doll, and the little girl's face lit up with joy. The giant found this, he said. His name is Sam, and he wants to make us breakfast." The children exchanged glances, hope and fear warring in their expressions. They'd been betrayed by adult promises before. "Do you trust him?" asked Daniel Swift Arrow, who at 11 was old enough to understand the weight of such decisions. Thomas thought about the gentleness in Sam's voice when he'd spoken about the Cherokee family who'd taught his wife to weave baskets. He thought about the way the giant had stood in his doorway, not blocking their escape, but opening his home. He thought about the fear in Sam's eyes, not fear of them, but fear for them. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "I think I do." As if summoned by his words, the smell of bacon began to drift up from the valley below, followed by the rich aroma of fresh biscuits baking. The children's stomachs growled almost in unison, and little Mary began to cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that food was close. "Then let's go meet our giant," Sarah said, gathering Mary into her arms. And one by one, 12 Cherokee children who had been running for their lives began to walk down the hill toward the promise of breakfast and the hope of something they'd almost forgotten existed: safety. The procession that descended from the ridge that morning would have been heartbreaking to anyone with eyes to see it. 12 Cherokee children, ages 4 to 13, walking slowly down the hillside toward Sam's cabin like a line of ghosts returning to the world of the living. Their clothes hung loose on frames that spoke of too many meals missed, too many nights spent shivering under inadequate blankets, too many days of walking on hope alone. Sam watched them approach from his kitchen window, his massive hands stilled on the cast-iron skillet where bacon sizzled and popped. He'd cooked enough breakfast to feed a logging crew: 3 dozen eggs, 2 pounds of bacon, 4 dozen biscuits rising in the oven, and a pot of oatmeal thick enough to stand a spoon in. Even so, looking at those hollow-cheeked faces, he wondered if it would be enough. Thomas led the group, walking slightly ahead with the careful posture of someone who'd appointed himself protector. Behind him came Sarah, carrying Mary Crow Feather on her hip despite being only 10 years old herself. The little girl's head lolled against Sarah's shoulder, her corn-husk doll clutched tightly in one small fist. Joseph Quiet Stream stumbled along beside them, his breath coming in short, rattling gasps that carried clearly in the still morning air. Sam's jaw tightened as he listened to that cough. He'd heard sounds like that before, during the fever epidemic that had taken Martha. The boy needed more than food. He needed warmth and rest and probably medicine that Sam didn't have. The other children followed in a loose group, their eyes darting constantly between Sam's cabin and the surrounding landscape, looking for threats or escape routes. Daniel Swift Arrow and Peter Stone Wolf flanked the younger ones protectively, while Rebecca Moonbeam held hands with twin boys, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. At the back of the group walked 2 older girls who moved with the careful grace of young women who'd learned too early that the world was not a safe place for Cherokee children. One was tall and willowy with intricate braids woven through with small feathers, while the other was shorter and stockier, her dark eyes missing nothing as she scanned the ranch buildings for any sign of danger. Sam set down his spatula and walked out onto the porch, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. He'd learned from dealing with skittish cattle that sudden movements could scatter a group that was already primed to run. The children stopped about 20 feet from the cabin, bunched together like a small herd facing a predator. "Good morning," Sam said quietly, his deep voice carrying easily across the distance. "I'm Sam. Thomas told me you might be hungry." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of Joseph's labored breathing and the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. Sam waited, understanding that trust was not something that could be rushed, especially by a man his size addressing children who had every reason to fear adults. It was little Mary who broke the standoff. She raised her head from Sarah's shoulder, looked directly at Sam with eyes that seemed too old for her 4-year-old face, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "We're starving, sir. The words hit Sam like a physical blow. Not "we're hungry" or "we'd like something to eat," but "we're starving," spoken with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children possessed. Behind her, he heard several of the other children shifting uncomfortably, as if Mary had said something they'd all been thinking but hadn't dared to voice. "Well then," Sam said, his voice rougher than he'd intended, "we'd better do something about that." He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving the door wide open behind him. It was an invitation and a leap of faith all at once, showing them he trusted them enough to turn his back, giving them a clear view of his kitchen and the abundance of food he was preparing. The smell that wafted out was like nothing the children had experienced in weeks. Bacon crackling in the pan, biscuits browning in the oven, coffee percolating on the stove. Sam heard whispered conversations in Cherokee behind him, rapid exchanges between Thomas and the older children that he couldn't understand, but didn't need to. They were making the same calculation he'd made that morning, whether to trust or run. "Thomas," Sam called over his shoulder as he pulled the biscuits from the oven, "could you help me carry some plates outside? I figure the porch might feel safer for everyone." There was a long pause, then the sound of careful footsteps on wooden boards. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his young face set in lines of determined courage. "The others want to know if you're alone." "Just me," Sam confirmed, loading biscuits onto a large wooden platter. "Haven't had company in a long time. They want to know if there are soldiers coming." Sam stopped what he was doing and turned to face Thomas directly. "Son, I give you my word, there are no soldiers coming. I haven't told anyone. You're here, and I won't. Not unless you want me to." Thomas studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "They also want to know why you're helping us." That was a harder question to answer. Sam looked out the window at the children still clustered in his yard, at Mary Crowfeather's pale face and Joseph's too thin frame, at the way they all held themselves ready to run at the first sign of danger. "Because," he said finally, "a long time ago, a Cherokee woman taught my wife something important. And I think Martha would haunt me if I turned away hungry children." He handed Thomas the platter of biscuits, still warm from the oven, and watched as the boy's eyes widened at the sight. "Take these out to your family. I'll bring the rest." Family. The word had slipped out without Sam thinking about it, but as Thomas carried the biscuits outside, Sam realized it was exactly right. These weren't just 12 random children. They were a family forged by necessity and hardship, bonded by their shared determination to stay together against impossible odds. By the time Sam emerged with platters of bacon and eggs, the children had arranged themselves in a rough semicircle on his porch. They sat close together, the older ones positioned protectively around the younger ones, but their attention was focused entirely on the food. Sam set the plates down carefully, then retreated to the far end of the porch to give them space. "Go ahead," he said gently. "There's plenty more where that came from." What followed was both beautiful and heartbreaking to watch. The children ate with the desperate efficiency of those who had known real hunger, but they shared everything, the older ones making sure the youngest got the choicest pieces, Mary Crowfeather being coaxed to eat even when she seemed too tired to lift the food to her mouth. Sam noticed things as he watched them eat. The way Sarah automatically cut Mary's bacon into tiny pieces. How Daniel Swift Arrow positioned himself between the younger children and the yard, still watching for threats even while eating. The careful way Thomas rationed his own portions, clearly used to making sure everyone else was fed first. Most telling of all was their silence. These children had learned that drawing attention to themselves was dangerous, that loud voices and laughter could bring unwanted notice. They ate like ghosts at a feast, grateful but cautious, ready to vanish at the first sign of trouble. "What are your names?" Sam asked softly when the initial frenzy of eating had slowed. "I'd like to know who I'm feeding." Thomas looked around at the others, receiving small nods of permission before he began the introductions. The little one is Mary Crow Feather. The boy with the cough is Joseph Quiet Stream. This is Sarah Gentle Rain, and Daniel Swift Arrow, and Peter Stone Wolf. He continued around the circle, introducing Rebecca Moonbeam and the twin boys, Michael and Matthew Beartrack, and the two older girls who turned out to be sisters named Anna and Lisa Deerpath. Each child looked up when their name was called, studying Sam's face as if trying to memorize it. "And you're all Cherokee?" Sam asked. "Our parents were from different bands," Thomas explained. "Some from Oklahoma, some from North Carolina, some from here in Montana. But we all ended up in the same settlement near the Judith River. Until the soldiers came," added Anna Deerpath quietly. She was the oldest of the girls at 12, with the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen too much of the world's cruelty for someone her age. Sam nodded. "Thomas told me a little about that. About the boarding schools." The children exchanged glances, and Sam saw fear flicker across their faces like shadows from a fire. Whatever they'd heard about those schools, it was bad enough too. Drive them into the wilderness rather than submit to that fate. "Well," Sam said, standing up and stretching his long frame, "I don't know much about schools, but I know about being warm and fed and safe. And I know that children shouldn't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from." He looked out over his ranch, the sturdy buildings, the fat cattle, the abundance that stretched as far as the eye could see. Then he looked back at 12 pairs of dark eyes watching him with a mixture of hope and wariness. "How would you feel about staying here for a while?" he asked. "Just until you figure out what comes next. I've got more room than I know what to do with, and Lord knows this place has been too quiet lately." The silence that followed was different from their earlier wariness. This was the silence of children afraid to hope for something too good to be true. Sam could almost see them processing his offer, weighing it against their experiences with adult promises that had been broken before. It was Mary Crow Feather who answered, her small voice cutting through the morning air like a bell. "You mean we can stay? All of us together, all of you together," Sam confirmed. "For as long as you need to." And for the first time since he'd been watching them, Sam saw something besides fear and hunger in their faces. He saw the dawning of something that looked very much like home. The first night was the hardest. Sam had cleared out his barn's upper loft, spreading fresh hay and every spare blanket he owned across the wooden floor. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm and dry, with the sweet smell of dried grass and the comforting sounds of animals moving below. Still, the children huddled together in the center of the space like survivors of a shipwreck, afraid to spread out, afraid to take up too much room. Sam climbed the ladder to check on them just before midnight, his massive frame creating shifting shadows in the lamplight. 12 pairs of eyes reflected back at him in the darkness. Not one of them was sleeping. "Everything all right up here?" he asked softly. Thomas sat up from where he'd been lying with his back against the wall, positioned so he could see both the ladder and the hayloft's small window. "We're fine, Mr. Sam, just listening." "Listening for what?" "Horses, soldiers, people who might want to take us away." Sam's heart clenched. These children had been running so long they'd forgotten how to rest. "There's nobody coming," he said firmly. "This is my land, and you're under my protection now. That means something out here. How do we know you won't change your mind?" The question came from Anna Deerpath, the 12-year-old with the steady gaze. Adults always change their minds about Indian children. Sam was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I suppose you don't know, not yet. But I'm hoping that time will prove what my words can't." He descended the ladder, but instead of going to his empty cabin, he pulled a chair out onto the porch and settled in for the night. If the children were going to stay awake listening for danger, the least he could do was be the first line of defense. The next morning, Thomas found him there, asleep in the chair with his rifle across his lap and dew sparkling on his shoulders. The sight of Sam keeping watch seemed to break something loose in the children. When they climbed down for breakfast, they moved with slightly less caution, and little Mary actually smiled when Sam handed her a cup of warm milk. "Did you sleep outside all night?" she asked, her 4-year-old directness cutting through the morning politeness. "Seemed like the thing to do," Sam replied, ruffling her dark hair with one enormous hand. "Figured if anybody was going to lose sleep worrying, it might as well be me." Over the following days, a routine began to emerge. Sam would rise before dawn to tend his cattle and horses, while the children gradually took over the care of the smaller animals, the chickens, the milk cow, the barn cat who had adopted them with the fickle loyalty of his species. Thomas proved to have a natural way with horses, and Sam found himself teaching the boy how to properly saddle and bridle the gentler mares. "You've done this before," Sam observed, watching Thomas run his hands along a horse's neck with practiced ease. "My grandfather taught me before." Thomas's voice trailed off, but Sam understood. Before the soldiers came. Before the world changed. Before everything they'd known was scattered to the winds. Sarah appointed herself keeper of the kitchen garden, coaxing the last tomatoes and squash from plants that were preparing for winter's sleep. She had her grandmother's hands, she told Sam shyly, hands that could make things grow even in difficult ground. Sam watched her work with the quiet intensity that had become familiar to him. These children approached everything as if their lives depended on doing it right. The twins, Michael and Matthew Beartrack, were inseparable 6-year-olds who communicated as much in looks and gestures as they did in words. They took charge of collecting eggs, a job that required them to work together to reach the higher nesting boxes. Sam built them a small step stool, and their delight at being able to do big kid work was infectious. Rebecca Moonbeam, the 7-year-old who could remember entire stories after hearing them once, became Sam's unofficial assistant in the evenings. She would sit on the porch steps while he whittled or mended tack, and he would tell her stories about the ranch, about the cattle drives he'd been on in his younger days, about the time a bear had wandered into his kitchen and eaten an entire pot of stew. "Tell me about your wife," Rebecca said one evening, her dark eyes serious in the lamplight. Sam's hands stilled on the harness he was repairing. "What would you like to know? What did she look like? What made her laugh? Did she sing?" Sam found himself smiling despite the familiar ache in his chest. "She was small, barely came up to my chest. Had red hair that caught fire in the sunlight and freckles across her nose. She laughed at everything, my clumsy attempts at dancing, the faces the calves made when they were nursing, the way I talked to the horses like they were people." "Did she want children?" The question was asked with the careful delicacy of a child who understood that some subjects were tender. Sam nodded slowly. "More than anything, we lost 3 babies before they could be born. The doctor said it was just one of those things, but Martha blamed herself." "That's why you help us," Rebecca said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes startled adults. "Because we're the children she couldn't have." Sam looked down at this 7-year-old who saw too much and understood even more. "Maybe so, little one. Maybe so." The days grew shorter and colder, but the barn loft grew warmer as the children began to spread out, to claim small spaces as their own. Daniel Swift Arrow carved his initials into one of the support beams. Sarah hung bundles of dried herbs from the rafters, filling the space with the scent of sage and sweetgrass. The twins built an elaborate fort from hay bales in one corner, complete with secret passages and lookout posts. Joseph's cough gradually improved with regular meals and warm, dry sleep. His color returned, and he began to laugh, a sound like water over stones that made Sam's heart lift every time he heard it. Mary Crow Feather put on weight, her hollow cheeks filling out as she discovered the joy of eating without having to save half for later. But it was the older children who worried Sam most. Anna and Lisa Deerpath moved through their days with the hypervigilance of young women who had learned that safety was always temporary. They helped with everything, complained about nothing, and never quite relaxed their guard. Peter Stone-Wolf, at 10, had the haunted look of a boy who had seen his parents taken away and understood that the same could happen to him. Sam began, making a point of having individual conversations with each child, learning their stories, their fears, their dreams. He discovered that Anna wanted to be a teacher, that Lisa could sing in 4 languages, that Peter dreamed of becoming a doctor so he could help his people. Thomas wanted to be a rancher, to have land of his own where Cherokee children could grow up safe and unafraid. "You think that's possible?" Thomas asked one evening as they walked the fence line together, checking for breaks or wear. "I think," Sam said carefully, "that the world is changing. Maybe not fast enough, and maybe not always for the better. But it's changing. And I think brave young men like you might be part of that change." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Sometimes I dream about the valley my grandmother told me about. The one where Cherokee feet remember the land and the trees sing our songs. Maybe you'll find it someday," Sam said. "Or maybe you'll make it." The first snow came early that year, dusting the mountains white while the valley still held on to the last colors of autumn. Sam woke to the sound of excited voices and looked out to see all 12 children standing in the yard, their faces turned up to catch the falling flakes on their tongues. It was the first time he'd seen them act like the children they were, not survivors or refugees or problems to be solved, but simply kids experiencing the magic of the season's first snow. Mary danced in circles with her arms outstretched, while the twins tried to catch snowflakes in their cupped hands. Even Anna smiled, a real smile that transformed her serious face into something luminous. Sam pulled on his coat and boots and joined them in the yard. "What do you think?" he called out over their laughter. "Think it'll stick?" "The snow speaks of a hard winter coming," said Lisa, tilting her face to the sky. "But we'll be warm." For the first time, Sam heard certainty in her voice when she spoke of the future. Not the careful hope of children afraid to believe good things might last, but the confident assumption that they would be here to see the winter through. That night, as Sam made his rounds checking on the animals and securing loose items against the wind, he paused outside the barn and listened to the sounds drifting down from the loft. Quiet conversations in Cherokee, muffled laughter, the rustle of children settling into sleep without fear. He thought of Martha, of the empty rooms in his cabin, of the silence that had been his only companion for 3 long years. The loneliness was still there. He didn't think it would ever fully go away, but it was different now. Instead of the hollow ache of loss, it had become something gentler, a bittersweet reminder of love that had been and love that was growing. 12 children had asked him for food, and somehow he'd found himself with a family. It wasn't the family he and Martha had dreamed of, but it was the family he needed, and maybe, just maybe, the family they needed too. Inside the barn, Thomas lay awake listening to the steady breathing of 11 younger children who trusted him to keep them safe. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found their valley after all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, carried by a postal rider who looked surprised to find children's laughter echoing from Sam's usually silent ranch. Sam signed for the official-looking envelope with a growing sense of dread, recognizing the territorial government seal pressed into the red wax. Inside the barn, Thomas was teaching the younger children how to braid rope from dried grass, a skill his grandfather had passed down to him. The morning light filtering through the gaps in the barn. Walls caught the dust motes dancing above their heads as small fingers worked to master the intricate patterns. "Like this, Thomas?" Mary held up her attempt, a lumpy creation that bore little resemblance to the smooth, even braids the older boy was producing. "Perfect, little sister," Thomas said, using the Cherokee term that had become natural among them all. The children had begun calling each other brother and sister, creating the family bonds that had been torn apart when the Soldiers scattered their communities. Sam watched them through the barn door for a moment before opening the letter, trying to memorize this scene of peaceful industry. Something told him that such moments might become precious memories sooner than he'd hoped. The letter was brief and official. Mr. Samuel Mackenzie, it has come to the attention of the Bureau of Indian Affairs that you may be harboring Cherokee children who are subjects of federal custody. These children are required by law to attend government educational facilities for their proper development and integration into civilized society. Agent Harrison Caldwell will arrive at your property within the week to conduct an investigation and collect any Indian children found to be in your custody. Cooperation with federal authorities is expected and appreciated. Respectfully, Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Sam read the letter twice, his massive hands trembling slightly. He'd known this day might come, but knowing hadn't made him any more prepared for it. Through the barn door, he could see Rebecca showing the twins how to make whistles from hollow reeds, her patient voice explaining each step. Anna was mending a torn shirt with careful stitches, while Lisa hummed an ancient Cherokee lullaby under her breath. They'd been here 6 weeks now. 6 weeks of growing stronger and healthier, of learning to laugh again, of becoming a family. And now the government wanted to tear it all apart in the name of civilized society. Bad news? Thomas had approached silently, his young face already shadowed with concern. The boy had developed an instinct for reading adult faces, a survival skill learned too early. Sam folded the letter carefully. We need to talk, all of us. Within minutes, all 12 children had gathered in the barn, sitting in their familiar semicircle with the younger ones in front. Sam took his time explaining the letter's contents, watching their faces as hope drained away like water from a broken bucket. How long do we have? Anna asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The letter says within the week. Could be tomorrow, could be Saturday. We could run again, suggested Daniel, but his heart wasn't in it. They all knew how that had worked out before. Cold nights, hungry days, and the constant fear of being caught. Where would we go? Mary asked in her small voice. I don't want to be hungry again. Sam knelt down to her level, his enormous frame folding until he could look into her dark eyes. You won't be hungry again, little one, I promise you that. But they're going to take us away, Joseph said, his recovered health making the prospect of returning to desperation even more heartbreaking. Maybe, Sam admitted, but maybe not. I've been thinking about this possibility for weeks now, and I might have an idea. He looked around the circle of faces, some hopeful, some resigned, all of them trusting him to find a solution that might not exist. What if you weren't Cherokee children in government custody? What if you were something else entirely? Thomas frowned. What do you mean? I mean, what if you were my children? Legally adopted. Citizens of Montana Territory with the right to live wherever your father chooses to raise you. The silence that followed was profound. The children stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. Can you do that? Sarah whispered. I don't know, Sam admitted. But I know a lawyer in Helena who might have answers. Judge Morrison has been a friend of my family for 20 years. If anyone can make this work, it's him. But we're Cherokee, Lisa said quietly. We can't stop being Cherokee. I wouldn't want you to, Sam said firmly. Being my children, if that's what you want, doesn't mean forgetting who you are or where you come from. It means having the protection of the law while you grow into the people you're meant to be. Rebecca looked up from the reed whistle she'd been turning over in her small hands. Would you really want us? All of us? Forever? The question hit Sam harder than he'd expected. These children had given his life meaning again, had filled his empty spaces with purpose and joy. The thought of losing them felt like losing Martha. All over again. I can't think of anything I'd want more, he said simply. Thomas stood up, his 13-year-old frame trying to carry the dignity of a tribal elder. "We need to vote. All of us together." "Agreed," Sam said. "But you should know, if we do this, if Judge Morrison can make it work, there will be people who won't like it. White folks who think I'm crazy for taking in Indian children. Indian folks who think I'm stealing you from your heritage. It won't be easy." "Nothing has been easy," Anna pointed out. "But we've been safe here. We've been happy." The vote was unanimous. Even little Mary raised her hand, though Sam suspected she wasn't entirely sure what she was voting for beyond staying with the people who had become her family. That afternoon, Sam saddled his fastest horse and rode hard for Helena, leaving the children with strict instructions to stay hidden if any strangers appeared. The ride normally took 2 days, but Sam pushed through the night, changing horses at a relay station and arriving at Judge Morrison's office as the sun painted the territorial Capitol's muddy streets gold. Judge Thaddeus Morrison was a small, neat man with silver whiskers and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He'd presided over Sam and Martha's wedding 7 years earlier, and he listened to Sam's story without interruption, his weathered hands steepled before him. 12 children, he mused when Sam finished. Cherokee children. And a federal agent. On his way to collect them. Can it be done, Thad? Can I adopt them legally? The judge was quiet for a long moment, staring out his window at the bustling street below. Legally? Perhaps. There are precedents. White families adopting Indian children has happened before, though usually it's been forced rather than chosen. The complications arise from the federal government's claim of custody. What would it take? Speed, for one thing. I'd need to file the adoption papers immediately, before Agent Caldwell arrives. Second, I'd need affidavits from the children themselves stating their desire to be adopted. Third, he paused, his expression growing troubled. Third, I'd need you to be absolutely certain this is what you want. Once those papers are filed, there's no going back. Those children become your responsibility for better or worse, in sickness and health, until they're grown and gone. Sam thought of Mary's laughter when she saw the first snow, of Thomas's quiet dignity as he protected the younger ones, of Rebecca's bright curiosity about everything from horse care to star patterns. He thought of the empty rooms in his cabin, and the silence that had nearly driven him mad with grief. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. Judge Morrison smiled then, the first real smile Sam had seen from him that day. "Then let's make some children legal. But Sam, we've got to move fast. If that federal agent arrives before the papers are properly filed and registered, all of this becomes much more complicated." They worked through the night, drawing up adoption papers for 12 children whose legal existence was murky at best. Morrison called in favors from clerks and scribes, pushing the paperwork through channels that normally took weeks to navigate. "One more thing," Morrison said as dawn broke over Helena's rooftops. "These children will need new legal names. Cherokee names aren't going to protect them in territorial courts." Sam had been dreading this moment. They can choose their own names, keep their Cherokee names as middle names if they want. But you're right, they'll need Anglo surnames. Mackenzie, Sam confirmed. All 12 of them. By the time Sam rode back toward his ranch, carrying a leather satchel full of legal documents, he was officially the father of 12 children he'd known for 6 weeks. But papers made it real in ways that daily life couldn't. These weren't just children he was helping. They were his children now, with all the joy and terror that entailed. He arrived home to find the children waiting anxiously in the barn, their faces lighting up when they saw him dismount. "Well?" Thomas asked. Sam held up the satchel. "Judge Morrison sends his congratulations to the Mackenzie family." The cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. Mary launched herself into Sam's arms with complete confidence that he would catch her, while the older children hugged each other and wiped away tears they hadn't realized they were shedding. What happens now? Sarah asked when the celebration died down. "Now we wait for Agent Caldwell," Sam said. "And we hope that a piece of paper is stronger than prejudice and federal authority." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Sam couldn't shake the feeling that their real test was just beginning. Agent Harrison Caldwell arrived on a Thursday morning with the kind of fanfare that announced trouble from miles away. 3 mounted men accompanied him, 2 federal marshals and a territorial sheriff, their badges glinting in the weak November sunlight as they rode up the path to Sam's ranch. Behind them came a covered wagon driven by a stern-faced woman in black dress and bonnet, her lips pressed into a line that suggested she'd never smiled in her life. Sam had been expecting them, but the sight of armed men approaching his home still sent his pulse hammering against his ribs. From the barn came the sound of children's voices suddenly going quiet. They'd been watching the road as carefully as he had, and they knew what this procession meant. Caldwell dismounted with the self-important air of a man accustomed to having his authority unquestioned. He was thin and angular, with pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw as either useful or disposable. His suit was expensive but travel-worn, and he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who believed that civilization was a constant battle against chaos. "Mr. Samuel Mackenzie?" His voice carried the flat authority of bureaucracy. "That's right." Sam stepped off his porch, deliberately placing himself between the visitors and the barn where his children were hiding. "You must be Agent Caldwell." "I am. I trust you received our correspondence regarding the Cherokee children reported to be on your property." Sam nodded slowly. "I did, though I'm afraid there's been some confusion." Caldwell's eyebrows rose slightly. "Confusion? There are no Cherokee children in federal custody on my land, Agent Caldwell. There are, however, 12 children who belong to me. Legally adopted children who carry my name and have every right to be here." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Caldwell's pale eyes narrowed as he processed this unexpected development, while the marshals shifted in their saddles, hands moving instinctively closer to their weapons. "That's quite impossible," Caldwell said finally. "These children are wards of the federal government, designated for placement in educational facilities. Individual adoption is not permitted under current regulations." Sam reached into his coat pocket, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid alarming the armed men. He pulled out the leather folder Judge Morrison had prepared, its official seals and ribbons marking it as a legal document of significant importance. "I think you'll find that territorial law disagrees with you, Agent Caldwell. These are the adoption papers, properly filed and registered with the territorial court in Helena." Judge Thaddeus Morrison presided over the proceedings personally. Caldwell snatched the folder from Sam's hands, his thin fingers rifling through the documents. With increasing agitation, Sam watched the man's face grow red as he realized the thoroughness of the legal work. Every signature properly witnessed, every seal authentic, every form filled out in triplicate. "This is highly irregular," Caldwell sputtered. "These children were already in federal custody. They cannot simply be adopted away from their legal status." "Actually, they can," came a new voice from the road. Judge Morrison rode up on a gray mare, his small frame somehow commanding more presence than all of Caldwell's armed escort combined. "Good morning, Agent Caldwell. I trust you're finding everything in order." Caldwell whirled to face the judge, his composure cracking visibly. "Judge Morrison, I wasn't expecting to find you here. I make it a point to attend important family gatherings," Morrison replied mildly, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who'd spent more years in courtrooms than on horseback. "And the Mackenzie family's first meeting with federal authority certainly qualifies. This is preposterous." Caldwell's voice rose to a near shout. "These are Indian children. They belong in schools where they can be properly civilized and educated. These," Judge Morrison corrected firmly, "are American citizens. legally adopted by a respected rancher and businessman. Their ethnicity, while interesting from an anthropological standpoint, has no bearing on their legal status. From behind Sam came the sound of footsteps on wooden boards. He turned to see Thomas walking out of the barn, his young face set in lines of determined courage. One by one, the other children followed, Sarah carrying Mary, the twins flanking Rebecca, Ina, and Lisa walking with their heads held high despite the fear Sam could see in their eyes. They arranged themselves beside Sam in the same protective formation they'd used that first morning on his porch, the older ones shielding the younger ones, all of them presenting a united front against the threat represented by Caldwell and his men. "There are my children," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying across the yard with surprising force. "All 12 of them. Thomas Whitehorse Mackenzie, Sarah Jenna-Lorraine Mackenzie, Mary Crowfeather Mackenzie." He continued down the line, giving each child their full legal name, their Cherokee names preserved as middle names, their new surname marking them as his own. Caldwell stared at the children as if they were some sort of elaborate trick being played on him. "This is impossible. The Bureau has records." These children were reported as runaways from federal custody. "The Bureau's records," Judge Morrison said with the cutting precision of a man who'd spent decades in courtrooms, "are incomplete and, in this case, irrelevant. These children were never in federal custody. They were refugees who sought and received sanctuary on Mr. Mackenzie's property. When he petitioned the territorial court for adoption rights, the court found no legal impediment to the proceedings. But they're Indians." The word hung in the air like a curse, and Sam felt his temper flare for the first time since the confrontation began. Behind him, he heard Mary begin to cry, not the loud wails of a typical 4-year-old, but the quiet, heartbroken sobs of a child who'd heard that word used as a weapon before. "They are my children," Sam said, his deep voice carrying a warning. That made even the marshals take notice. "And I'll thank you not to speak of them in that tone on my property." Caldwell seemed to realize he'd overplayed his hand. He straightened his coat and attempted to regain his bureaucratic composure. "Perhaps we can reach some accommodation. The government boarding schools are excellent facilities, designed specifically for the education of of children from indigenous backgrounds. Surely you can see the benefits of specialized education." "I can see the benefits of children growing up in a loving home with people who care about them," Sam replied. "These children are thriving here. They're healthy, they're happy, and they're learning skills that will serve them well in life. But they're not learning to be proper Americans. They're learning to be themselves," Thomas said suddenly, his young voice carrying clearly across the yard. "And they're learning that being Cherokee doesn't make them less American." Caldwell turned his pale eyes on the 13-year-old. "You're the leader of this group, aren't you? The one who convinced the others to run away?" "I'm the one who kept them alive when the government wanted to separate us from our families," Thomas replied without flinching. "And now I'm Sam's son, which means I have the right to speak for myself." "Children don't have rights," Caldwell snapped. "Children have obligations to obey their elders and accept the education the government provides for their benefit. These children have the rights of any American citizen," Judge Morrison interjected smoothly, "including the right to remain with their legally appointed guardian unless compelling evidence of abuse or neglect can be presented." "Do you have such evidence, Agent Caldwell?" Caldwell looked around at the well-maintained ranch, at the healthy, clean children standing protectively beside their enormous adoptive father, at the obvious bonds of affection and respect that connected this unlikely family. His pale eyes reflected his growing realization that he was fighting a battle he couldn't win with the weapons he brought. "This isn't over," he said finally. "The Bureau will not accept this irregularity. There will be appeals, investigations, challenges to the adoption proceedings. And we'll meet every one of them in court," Judge Morrison replied cheerfully. "I do so enjoy a good legal challenge," and I believe Mr. Mackenzie's attorney fees are paid well in advance. Caldwell remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. The woman in the wagon, presumably matron from one of the boarding schools, had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but her disapproving gaze swept over the children like a cold wind. "You're making a mistake, Mackenzie," Caldwell called down from his saddle. "These children will never be truly civilized living out here in the wilderness with a man who doesn't understand their special needs." Sam looked at Mary, who had stopped crying and was now holding his hand with both of her small ones. He looked at Thomas, standing tall and proud despite his youth. He looked at Sarah, who was gently braiding Rebecca's hair while keeping a protective eye on the twins. "Agent Caldwell," Sam said quietly, "I think you're the one who doesn't understand their needs." As the government party rode away, kicking up clouds of dust that the wind quickly scattered, Sam felt Thomas move to stand beside him. "Is it really over?" the boy asked. "This part is," Sam replied, "but there will be other challenges." Caldwell wasn't lying about appeals and investigations. "We'll face them together," Anna said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began, "all of us, as a family." Sam looked down at 12 faces looking up at him with trust and determination, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Martha died. It wasn't just love, though he loved these children with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him daily. It was purpose, meaning, the knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. "Yes," he said simply, "as a family." Above them, the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue, vast enough to hold all the dreams and hopes and challenges that lay ahead. And for the first time since this extraordinary journey began, Sam Mackenzie felt confident that they could handle whatever came next, together. Word traveled fast in Montana territory, carried by gossip that spread like wildfire across ranches, through saloons, and into the parlors of respectable families. By the time Sam rode into Millfield for supplies 3 weeks after Caldwell's visit, every person on Main Street knew that the lonely giant of Copper Ridge had adopted 12 Cherokee children and successfully defied the federal government to keep them. The reactions were as varied as the people themselves, but none of them were neutral. Sam tied his horse outside Brennan's general store and immediately felt the weight of stares following his every movement. Mrs. Eleanor Brennan, who had always greeted him with professional courtesy, now watched him through narrowed eyes as he approached her counter with his list of supplies. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said coolly, her hands folded tightly over her apron, "I trust you're managing well with your new circumstances." "Managing just fine, Mrs. Brennan. Thank you for asking." Sam placed his order on the counter. Flour, sugar, coffee, and a dozen other staples needed to feed a family of 13. "I'll need double quantities of most everything now." "Yes, I imagine you would." Her tone carried implications that had nothing to do with the size of his grocery order. Feeding so many children must be quite expensive. "Worth every penny," Sam replied mildly, though he could feel tension building in his shoulders. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, Frank Morrison, a cattle rancher from the East Valley and no relation to Judge Morrison. Despite the shared surname, Frank was a hard man who'd built his spread through equal parts determination and ruthlessness, and he'd never been shy about sharing his opinions. Well, Frank said loudly enough for the entire store to hear. "If it isn't Sam Mackenzie, the famous Indian lover." The words hit the air like a slap. Mrs. Brennan's mouth tightened into a disapproving line, and several other customers turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Sam slowly turned to face Frank, his massive frame making the other rancher look smaller by comparison. "Frank," Sam said evenly, "something I can help you with?" "Oh, I think you've helped enough already," Frank sneered. "Bringing all those savage children onto decent land, teaching them they belong among civilized folk. Some of us remember what Apaches did to the Henderson family 2 summers back. These are Cherokee children, Frank, and they're my children now. Cherokee, Apache, Comanche, they're all the same underneath. Wild blood, wild ways. You can dress them up in white clothes and teach them English, but it doesn't change what they are. Sam felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. Behind him, he could hear Mrs. Brennan muttering agreement under her breath, and the other customers were nodding along with Frank's words. The weight of community disapproval pressed down on him like a physical thing. What they are, Sam said carefully, is children who needed help. Children who were hungry and scared and running for their lives. Children who belonged in government schools where they could be properly controlled, Frank shot back. Instead, you've got them running loose on your land, probably teaching them to use bows and arrows, filling their heads with savage ideas about land ownership and tribal nonsense. I'm teaching them to read and write and work with their hands, Sam replied. Same as any father would teach his children. They're not your children. Frank's voice rose to a shout. They're not white, they're not civilized, and they don't belong in a Christian community. The store fell silent except for the ticking of Mrs. Brennan's wall clock. Sam could feel every eye in the place focused on him, waiting to see how he would respond to this public challenge to his family. For a moment, he was tempted to grab Frank by his shirt front and show him exactly what a gentle giant could do. When pushed too far, instead, he took a deep breath and thought of Thomas's dignity under pressure, of Mary's trust when she called him Papa Sam, of Sarah's quiet strength as she helped hold the family together. Frank, Sam said quietly, I've known you for 8 years. You're a hard worker and a decent neighbor when you choose to be. But if you ever speak about my children that way again, you and I are going to have a serious problem. Frank's eyes flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. Sam Mackenzie had never raised his voice in anger, never started a fight, never shown anything but gentle courtesy to his neighbors. But there was something in his voice now that suggested depths of protective fury that Frank wasn't prepared to test. Your supplies will be ready for pickup tomorrow, Mrs. Brennan said abruptly, clearly wanting to end the confrontation before it escalated further. Cash payment in advance. Sam nodded and placed money on the counter, more than enough to cover his order. As he turned to leave, Frank spoke again, his voice lower but no less venomous. Mark my words, Mackenzie. Those children will bring nothing but trouble to this valley. And when they do, don't expect the rest of us to clean up your mess. Sam paused at the door, but didn't turn around. The only mess I see, Frank, is the kind of thinking that judges children by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. The ride home gave Sam time to think about what he'd encountered in town. Frank Morrison wasn't the only one who felt that way. Sam had seen it in other faces, heard it in whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. The community that had accepted him as an eccentric but harmless giant now viewed him as something more dangerous, a man who challenged their assumptions about race and belonging. But there had been other reactions too. Dr. William Hayes, the territory's only physician, had stopped him outside the store to ask about the children's health and to offer his services if any of them needed medical attention. What you're doing takes courage, the doctor had said quietly. Not everyone has the strength to do what's right when what's right isn't popular. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, the schoolteacher, had sent word through her husband that she'd be willing to come to the ranch twice a week to help with the children's formal education. Every child deserves to read and write properly, her message had said. Heritage is important, but so is preparation for the future. Even old Pete Harrison, Sam's nearest neighbor, had ridden over the previous week with a side of venison and a gruff offer to help with any ranch work that 13 people might create. Children are children, Pete had said in his laconic way. Anyone who says different is a fool. So the community was divided, which Sam supposed was better than being uniformly hostile. But the encounter with Frank had made one thing clear. The legal victory over Agent Caldwell was just the beginning of their challenges. They would face social ostracism, economic pressure, and probably worse from people who saw the children's presence as a threat to their vision of what Montana Territory should become. When Sam reached home, he found his family gathered around the kitchen table he'd built specially to accommodate all 13 of them. The children were working on their lessons, some practicing letters on slates, others reading from the collection of books Judge Morrison had donated, the youngest ones learning numbers by counting dried beans into small piles. "How did it go in town, Papa Sam?" Rebecca asked, looking up from the arithmetic problems she was solving with impressive skill for a 7-year-old. Sam hung his hat on its peg and considered how much to tell them. These children had already faced enough adult cruelty for several lifetimes, but they also deserved honesty about the world they were growing up in. "Mixed reactions," he said finally. "Some folks are happy for us, some aren't. But that's their problem, not ours." Thomas looked up from the book he was reading, a treatise on modern farming techniques that he'd requested from Judge Morrison's library. At 13, he was old enough to read between the lines of adult conversations. "Bad reactions?" he asked. "Some," Sam admitted. "But I want you all to remember something. There will always be people who judge you before they know you, who make assumptions based on how you look or where you come from. That says something about them, not about you." "What if they try to hurt us?" Anna asked quietly. She'd been unusually subdued since Caldwell's visit, as if the confrontation had reminded her that their safety was more fragile than it seemed. "Then they'll have to go through me first," Sam said simply. "And I'm bigger than most." Mary giggled at that, her 4-year-old sense of humor delighted by the image of her giant Papa Sam standing between them and the world. But the older children understood the serious promise behind his words. "We could fight our own battles," Daniel suggested. "We're not helpless." "I know you're not," Sam replied. "But families protect each other. That's what families do." "What about school?" Sarah asked. "Mrs. Walsh sent word about teaching us, but what happens when we're older? What if they won't let us attend the regular school?" It was a practical question that cut to the heart of their situation. These children were bright and eager to learn, but territorial schools might not welcome Cherokee students, no matter what. Their adoption papers said. "Then we'll build our own school," Sam said. "Or send you to schools in the East where prejudice isn't quite so thick on the ground. We'll figure it out." "Could we really do that?" Rebecca asked, her eyes bright with possibility. "Build our own school? Why not?" Sam settled into his chair, which creaked under his weight. "Thomas wants to be a rancher. Anna wants to be a teacher. Lisa could teach music and languages. We could create something new, a place where Cherokee children and white children learn together, where everyone's heritage is respected. A school where being different is good instead of bad," Mary added solemnly, and Sam felt his heart clench at the wisdom in her innocent words. "Exactly, little one. A school where being different is good instead of bad." As the evening wore on, and the children gradually settled into their bedtime routines, Sam found himself thinking about Frank Morrison's ugly words and the uncomfortable truth they represented. The legal battle might be won, but the social battle was just beginning. But looking at his family, 12 children who'd found safety and love against all odds, who were growing stronger and more confident each day, Sam felt a quiet determination settle in his chest. Let Frank Morrison and his ilk think what they wanted. Let them whisper and judge and exclude. These children were his now, and he was theirs. And together, they would build something better than the narrow, fearful world that some people wanted to create. They would build a place where starving children could find not just food, but home. December brought a cold that seemed to reach into the very bones of the earth, freezing streams solid and covering the Montana landscape in snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the pale winter sun. The storm that had been threatening for weeks finally arrived with the fury of nature unleashed, trapping the Mackenzie family in their ranch for 3 days while wind howled around the buildings like the voices of angry spirits. But inside the barn loft that had become the children's dormitory, warmth and laughter filled the space despite the chaos outside. Sam had spent weeks preparing for this moment, installing a second wood stove, banking hay bales around the walls for extra insulation, and teaching the older children how to maintain steady heat through the long mountain nights. "Tell us about the Christmas when you were little, Papa Sam," Mary requested from her nest of quilts, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. The children had taken to calling him Papa Sam, a compromise between respect and affection that made his heart swell every time he heard it. Sam settled his massive frame onto the hay bale that served as his evening chair, careful not to put too much weight on the makeshift furniture. "Well, little one, Christmas in Ohio was different from what we'll have here. My mother would start preparing weeks in advance, baking cookies and cakes, making presents by hand." "What kind of presents?" asked Rebecca, who was teaching herself to knit with yarn Sam had bought in town, her small fingers working the needles with surprising skill. "Practical things, mostly. New mittens, carved wooden toys, maybe a book if we'd been especially good. Money was tight, but love was abundant." Thomas looked up from the harness he was mending, a skill Sam had taught him that proved useful during the long winter evenings. "What about Cherokee Christmas celebrations? Do you know anything about how our people marked the winter season?" It was a thoughtful question that showed how the boy was working to bridge his two worlds, the Cherokee heritage he was determined to preserve and the American culture he was learning to navigate. Sam considered his words carefully. "Your grandmother, Sarah, would know better than I do," he said. "But I remember Martha's Cherokee friends talking about winter ceremonies, times for storytelling, for remembering the ancestors, for celebrating the survival of the community through the hardest season. Grandmother Sarah told me stories," offered Lisa, her soft voice carrying clearly through the warm air. "She said winter was when the old ones came closest to our world, when the veil between the living and the dead grew thin enough for wisdom to pass through." "Then maybe this winter we honor both traditions," Sam suggested. "Christmas morning with presents and a feast, and winter nights with Cherokee stories and ceremonies." The idea sparked excitement among the children. Anna and Lisa began planning traditional Cherokee dishes they could prepare with available ingredients, while the younger ones begged for more details about what Christmas morning might bring. Sam watched their animated discussions with the deep contentment that had become his constant companion, but their peaceful evening was interrupted by the sound of horses struggling through the snow outside, followed by urgent pounding on the cabin door. Sam glanced at Thomas, who immediately began organizing the younger children into their practiced hiding positions, old habits from their fugitive days that might still prove necessary. Sam descended from the loft and approached the cabin door. With his rifle in hand, though he left the weapon hanging loosely at his side. Through the frost-covered window, he could make out two figures bundled in heavy coats, their horses steaming in the bitter cold. "Son Mackenzie?" The voice was unfamiliar, strained with cold and exhaustion. "We need help. Our wagon broke down about 2 miles back, and we've got sick folks who won't make it through the night in this weather." Sam opened the door to find a middle-aged man and woman, both clearly at the edge of their endurance. The man's beard was crusted with ice, and the woman's lips were blue despite the heavy scarf wrapped around her face. "I'm Sam Mackenzie," he said, stepping aside to let them enter. "How many people are we talking about?" "6, the man gasped, grateful for the cabin's warmth. "My wife and I, our 2 young ones, and an elderly couple we're traveling with. The old man took sick yesterday, and the cold's making it worse." Sam didn't hesitate. "Thomas," he called toward the barn. "Saddle up the draft horses and hitch the sleigh. We've got people to rescue." The teenager appeared in the doorway with remarkable speed, already pulling on his coat. Behind him came Daniel and Peter, equally ready to help despite the dangerous conditions outside. "Boys, I appreciate the offer, but this weather's too harsh for—" "With respect, Papa Sam," Thomas interrupted. "You taught us that families help each other, and neighbors count as family when they're in trouble. Besides, you'll need extra hands to get 6 people back here safely." Sam looked at the determined faces of his sons. When had he started thinking of them that way so naturally? And felt a surge of pride that warmed him more than the cabins. "Fire, all right, but we do this careful and smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks." The rescue mission took 3 hours of brutal work in the howling wind and driving snow. They found the stranded family huddled in their broken wagon, the elderly man barely conscious from fever and cold exposure, working together with the efficiency born of trust and training. Sam and the boys loaded the travelers into the sleigh and made the treacherous journey back to the ranch. By the time they reached safety, the storm had intensified to the point where visibility extended only a few yards in any direction. But the warm lights of the cabin and barn guided them home like beacons of hope in the wilderness. The rescued family, the Hendersons, traveling from Minnesota to Oregon, were overwhelmed by the hospitality that greeted them. Sarah and Anna had prepared the cabin's spare room for the elderly couple, while Rebecca and Lisa had hot soup ready for everyone. The Henderson children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, stared in wide-eyed amazement at the Cherokee children who moved around them with quiet competence. Are they Indians?" The little Henderson girl whispered to her mother with the innocent curiosity of childhood. Before Mrs. Henderson could respond, Mary stepped forward with the grave dignity that 4-year-olds sometimes possess. "We're Cherokee," she said clearly, "but we're also Americans. And we're Sam's children, which makes us your hosts." The simple statement, delivered without defensiveness or apology, seemed to settle something in the room. Mr. Henderson, warming his hands around a cup of hot coffee, looked at Sam with new understanding. "These are your children?" he asked. "All 12 of them," Sam confirmed. "Adopted, legal and proper, though that's not what makes them mine." "What does?" Sam looked around the cabin, at the Cherokee children caring for white strangers with the same generosity they'd been shown, at Thomas helping the elderly man out of his wet clothes, at Sarah spooning soup for the Henderson children, as if they were her own siblings. "Love," Sam said simply. "Love and choice, and the decision to stand together, no matter what the world throws at us." Mrs. Henderson, a practical woman who'd been watching the children's efficient care with growing amazement, spoke up for the first time. "I've heard stories about Indian children, wild tales about savagery and violence, but these children double quote." She paused, searching for words. "They're the most civilized young people I've ever encountered." "Civilization isn't about skin color," Thomas said quietly, helping the old man settle into a comfortable chair near the fire. "It's about how you treat people who need help." The storm raged for 2 more days, keeping all 9 visitors trapped at the ranch. But what could have been a tense and difficult situation became something else entirely. An unexpected community where Cherokee and white children played together, where adults shared stories and songs from different traditions, where the barriers that usually divided people seemed to melt away like snow in spring sunshine. On the second evening, as the wind finally began to die down, old Mr. Peterson, the sick man who'd recovered quickly under Sarah's careful nursing, asked Thomas about his plans for the future. "I want to be a rancher," Thomas said. "Build something like what Papa Sam has built here, but bigger. A place where Cherokee families can live safely, where our children can learn both Cherokee ways and American ways." "That's a big dream for a young man," Peterson observed. "Big dreams require big hearts," Thomas replied, glancing at Sam. "And I've learned from the biggest heart I know." When the storm finally passed and the Henderson family prepared to continue their journey to Oregon, the goodbyes were emotional. The two families had formed bonds that transcended race and background, creating friendships that would endure through letters and occasional visits for years to come. "You've given us more than shelter," Mr. Henderson told Sam as they loaded their repaired wagon. "You've given us hope that this country might become something better than what it is now." "Children are always the hope," Sam replied, watching, as Mary hugged the Henderson girl goodbye. "They don't see the barriers we adults insist on building." As the visitors disappeared down the snow-covered road, Sam stood on his porch with 12 Cherokee children gathered around him, their faces bright with the satisfaction of having helped strangers become friends. The winter sun sparkled on the winter. Fresh snow and the air carried the crisp promise of spring still months away. "Are you proud of us, Papa Sam?" Mary asked, slipping her small hand into his enormous one. "Prouder than you'll ever know, little one," Sam replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Prouder than you'll ever know." And in that moment, surrounded by the children who'd transformed his empty house into a home full of love and laughter, Sam Mackenzie understood that the test of winter hadn't been about surviving the cold or the storm. It had been about proving that the family they'd built was strong enough to extend its warmth to others, generous enough to share what they had, and confident enough in their own worth to bridge the divides that separated people. They had passed that test with flying colors, and Sam knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not just as a family, but as living proof that love could indeed conquer fear, that kindness could overcome prejudice, and that home was not a place but a choice made daily by people who decided to stand together against the storms of life. 5 years later, in the spring of 1893, the Mackenzie Ranch had transformed into something that would have been unimaginable. When 12 starving Cherokee children first stumbled down from the ridge, what had begun as one lonely man's act of compassion had grown into a beacon of hope that drew visitors from across the territory and beyond. The ranch itself had expanded dramatically. Thomas, now 18 and Sam's full partner in the business, had proven to have an intuitive understanding of cattle and land management that impressed even veteran ranchers. Under his guidance, they'd acquired adjacent properties, built new barns and outbuildings, and established a reputation for raising some of the finest beef in Montana territory. But it wasn't the commercial success that made the Mackenzie Ranch famous. It was the school. The Copper Ridge Academy stood on a hill overlooking the main ranch buildings, a sturdy 2-story structure built from local stone and timber. What made it remarkable wasn't its architecture, but its revolutionary approach to education. Cherokee children learned alongside white children, studying everything from classical literature to traditional Cherokee languages, from modern agriculture to ancient storytelling traditions. Anna Deer Path Mackenzie, now 17 and every inch the teacher she'd dreamed of becoming, stood before a classroom of 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Half were Cherokee children who'd found their way to the ranch through networks of families seeking alternatives to government boarding schools. The other half were white children whose parents had overcome their prejudices enough to recognize quality education when they saw it. "Today we're going to study the Lewis and Clark expedition," Anna announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to command respect through competence. "But we're going to examine it from multiple perspectives, not just the American explorers, but the native tribes who guided them, the French traders who facilitated their journey, and the impact their expedition had on the indigenous peoples they encountered." In the back of the classroom, 9-year-old Mary Crow Feather Mackenzie raised her hand. She'd grown into a bright, confident child whose early years of starvation and fear seemed like distant memories. "Miss Anna, why didn't the history books we read last year mention the native guides?" "That's an excellent question, Mary. Who can think of some reasons why certain perspectives might be left out of official histories?" The discussion that followed was exactly the kind of critical thinking Sam had envisioned when he'd first proposed building their own school. These children, Cherokee and white alike, were learning to question assumptions, to seek multiple viewpoints, to understand that truth was often more complex than simple narratives suggested. Outside the schoolhouse, Rebecca Moonbeam Mackenzie was leading a group of younger children in a music lesson that blended Cherokee songs with European melodies. At 12, she'd already mastered 3 languages and could play 4 different instruments. Her dream was to become a composer who would create music that honored both her Cherokee heritage and her American citizenship. Music is a universal language, she told her students as they practiced a song that combined English words with Cherokee rhythms. It builds bridges between different worlds. Down at the main house, Sam was meeting with a delegation of visitors who'd traveled from as far away as Boston to see the Montana miracle for themselves. The group included educators, government officials, and philanthropists who were trying to understand how a giant rancher and 12 Cherokee children had created something that seemed to work better than anything the experts had devised. The key, Sam was explaining to Dr. Margaret Williams, a professor from Harvard who'd been studying innovative educational approaches, isn't trying to erase the children's heritage or force them into a mold that doesn't fit. It's helping them understand that they can be fully Cherokee and fully American at the same time. But surely there must be conflicts, pressed Senator James Bradley, a politician who'd been skeptical of the whole enterprise. Cultural differences that create problems. Of course there are differences, Sam acknowledged. But differences don't have to mean conflicts. They can mean richness, variety, strength. A rope made from different kinds of fibers is stronger than one made from a single material. Thomas entered the room carrying a leather portfolio filled with ranch records and correspondence. At 18, he'd grown into a young man whose presence commanded respect from people twice his age. His Cherokee features were unmistakable, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to stand in any room and speak his mind. "Gentlemen, ma'am," he said with a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Papa Sam, the Territorial Governor's Office has responded to our proposal for the new Agricultural Extension Program." "What did they say?" Sam asked, though Thomas's expression already suggested good news. "They're approving our pilot program. We'll be working with ranchers across 3 counties to improve cattle breeding techniques and land management practices. The Cherokee traditional knowledge about sustainable grazing will be combined with modern scientific methods." Dr. Williams leaned forward with interest. "You're saying that Cherokee agricultural traditions have practical value for modern farming? Native peoples have been managing this land successfully for thousands of years," Thomas replied matter-of-factly. "It would be foolish not to learn from that experience. The trick is combining traditional wisdom with new technologies in ways that benefit everyone." Senator Bradley looked skeptical. "And you believe this kind of integration is the future?" "I believe it's the present," Thomas said firmly. "The question isn't whether Cherokee people and white people will share this continent. We already do. The question is whether we'll do it with mutual respect and shared benefit, or with continued conflict and waste." Later that evening, after the visitors had departed for their accommodations in town, the extended Mackenzie family gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner. The dining room Sam had built to accommodate large groups was filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the gentle chaos that comes with raising multiple children. Sarah Gentle Rain Mackenzie, now 15 and the ranch's unofficial head of household management, was directing the twins and setting the table while simultaneously helping Joseph with his arithmetic homework. The twins, Michael and Matthew Beartrack, were now 11 and had become inseparable partners in every ranch enterprise, from cattle herding to mechanical repairs. Lisa Deerpath Mackenzie had returned from her first year at the Territorial College in Helena, where she was studying law with the intention of becoming an advocate for Native rights. At 17, she possessed a fierce intelligence and an unshakable sense of justice that reminded Sam of Martha's quiet determination to fight for what was right. "Tell us about college, Lisa," urged Daniel Swift Arrow Mackenzie, who at 16 was considering his own educational path. "Is it what you expected?" "It's challenging," Lisa admitted, pausing to help Mary cut her meat into manageable pieces. "Some of the professors have never had a Cherokee student before, and some of the other students have interesting opinions about Indians. But I'm learning, and more importantly, I'm proving that Cherokee minds are just as capable as any others." "What about after college?" asked Peter Stonewolf Mackenzie, now 15 and showing remarkable aptitude for engineering and construction. "What will you do with a law degree?" "Change the world," Lisa said simply, and no one at the table doubted she would try that as the meal wound down and the children began their evening chores. Sam found himself standing on the porch that had witnessed so many important moments in his family's history. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that never failed to take his breath away. Thomas joined him, as he often did during these quiet evening moments. The young man had grown tall and strong, though he'd never approached Sam's giant stature. More importantly, he'd grown into a leader whose judgment Sam trusted completely. "The visitors seemed impressed," Thomas observed, leaning against the porch railing. "They were. Dr. Williams wants to write a book about our school. Senator Bradley is talking about introducing legislation to fund similar programs in other territories. And what do you think about that?" Sam considered the question carefully. "I think it's wonderful if other children can benefit from what we've learned. But I also think that each situation is unique. What worked for us might not work exactly the same way somewhere else." "Because it wasn't just about education or integration or any of those big concepts," Thomas said. "It was about 12 scared, hungry children and one lonely man who decided to care about each other." "Exactly." Sam smiled at the young man who'd become his son in every way that mattered. "Love isn't a policy or a program. It's a choice you make every day." "Speaking of choices," Thomas said, his tone becoming more serious, "I've been offered a position with the territorial government, assistant to the Commissioner of Agriculture. It would mean leaving the ranch, at least for a while." Sam felt his heart clench, but he kept his expression neutral. "What do you want to do?" "I want to make a difference on a larger scale. Use what I've learned here to help other Cherokee communities, other ranchers, other families trying to build bridges instead of walls." Thomas paused, studying Sam's face. "But I don't want to leave you to manage everything alone." "Son," Sam said gently, "the whole point of raising children is to prepare them to fly on their own. If you can help other families find what we found here, then that's exactly what you should do. The ranch will be here when you're ready to come back. And if I decide not to come back, if I find my path leads somewhere else entirely?" Sam looked out over the ranch that had become so much more than he'd ever dreamed possible. He thought of Martha, of the children she'd never been able to hold, of the family they'd planned but never had. Then he thought of 12 Cherokee children who'd asked for food and received a home, who'd needed safety and found love, who'd faced the world's prejudices and emerged stronger for the struggle. "Then I'll be proud of you for having the courage to follow your dreams," Sam said. "That's what fathers do. They raise their children to become the people they're meant to be, even if that means letting them go." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sam felt a profound sense of completion. The lonely giant who'd once sat on this same porch listening to the wind and aching with grief had been transformed by the simple act of saying yes. When 12 children asked for help, the Cherokee children who'd once whispered, "We're starving, sir," were now young adults preparing to change the world. They'd kept their Cherokee names and traditions, while mastering the skills they needed to succeed in American society. They'd proven that identity wasn't about choosing sides, but about integrating all the pieces of yourself into something whole and strong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new choices to make about how to live and love and build bridges across the divides that separated people. But tonight, Sam Mackenzie sat on his porch, surrounded by the sounds of his children preparing for bed. And he knew with absolute certainty that some questions had answers that were beautifully simple. "We're starving, sir," 12 children had said. "Then you're all mine now," he'd replied. And in that exchange, desperate need meeting generous love, they'd all found exactly what they'd been searching for without knowing it. They'd found home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.